It's great to see you. Ryan, thanks for the kind introduction. And it's phenomenal to be back for a second time. And as Ryan was suggesting, the room is full for a reason, because cybersecurity is taking greater prevalence than ever before. I think it's commendable, by the way, that the kingdom is serving as what I like to call the Intel chip inside the computer. If you remember the ad campaign from the 2000s, it was the chip that was driving the computer at the time. I think the kingdom has a very unique role to play as one that convenes everybody like we are doing today, lead from behind to take action for the future. And I would suggest geographically, straddling north and south and east and west, it has a particularly strong position in which to do so. Governor, it's great to see you, and thank you for the opening remarks. And it's nice to be in Riyadh again. I think I'm here 10 times a year because of the transformation that's taking place. Can we give a nice round of applause for the excellent panel that's been assembled today, and we'll get right into the debate. We have 45 minutes in which to delve into these very key issues. And you all three sit at the nexus of geopolitics and geoeconomics. If it's okay, Governor, I think it's also worth noting that we should recognize the global crisis that we're facing today when it comes to conflicts, and we'd love to see a solution. But our role here at the GCF is to hone in on cybersecurity and a safe cyberspace for all. So we'd like to see solutions, but at the same time, clearly, not in this room because everybody works in cybersecurity, but globally, awareness needs to raise about the opportunities and the threats, because cyberspace knows no boundaries. And because you're both specialists in geoeconomics and geopolitics, how do you see, President Barroso, the forces driving the change in this sector today and what we should be aware of? Because it's, what would you call, extreme complexity in the world, there's no doubt about it.
Thank you. Thank you, John, for your introduction. Your Royal Highness, Ministers, Excellencies, dear friends. I believe the developments are quite worrying, to be very frank, in terms of cybersecurity, in the sense that we have, on one side, technological change in some sectors, like artificial intelligence, generative artificial intelligence, and what we can call superintelligence, and also quantum computing and other areas, that will probably make it more difficult to keep high level of cybersecurity. So this technological change is a challenge for the protection of data, protection of networks and cyber systems. And on the other side, as John, you mentioned, there are the very worrying geopolitical developments. From that point of view, I can share with you my experience. I remember when I was leading the European Commission that, for instance, in the G20, by the way, where Saudi Arabia is a very important member, there was some level of cooperation and sincere cooperation between the United States, China, Europe, and others. I'm not sure, to be very frank, this is exactly what's happening today. So the level of confidence and sincere cooperation globally is going down. Cybersecurity should be seen as a global public good, because, as you said, cyber criminals, they don't stop at borders. They are threatening all of us. But the reality is that because of the links to technology, some powers, they will try to keep as much as possible their prerogatives. They will resist any kind of, let's say, supranational regulation or system. So that's why I think it's very important to find spaces like this one here in Saudi Arabia. And I'm not saying that just to be nice to you, most of you here coming from Saudi, but because I think Saudi Arabia has a good place globally, being also a member of the G20, to foster some dialogue, being realistic, what can be achieved at some level between all the powers of the world, and in other areas being more, let's say, precise about what we can develop further. But it's going to be a very challenging task from a geopolitical point of view.
Good. Madam President, we had a founder of CNN, Ted Turner, who said he was in cable before cable was cool. right? He was an entrepreneur that wanted to break new boundaries, and Estonia was very much an early mover and an early example of both e-government, but also recognizing the role of cybersecurity. I'd love to have you share your perspectives of the key factors you see at play today. Number one, we've come out of COVID-19 with record spending by government, right? And high debt. 10 years before that, we had the global financial crisis. And one of the things you noted is that we have to be very aware of what's going on in society, but you're seeing the cost of this to fortify industry, academia, our civil society overall in terms of day-to-day living. What are you seeing here as a cost driver and the importance of getting deeper collaboration amongst governments?
Well, I've used an example for about 8 years to start these kind of discussions. And this example tells you about the little AI worm. It's a little worm which is specifically designed to enter military systems, weapon systems, maybe even nuclear systems. And it is able to gather all the data which you have in that system and hurt it, destroy it. This is how it is trained. But now imagine this system is somewhere, and somebody has contaminated the data set of that system by using a computer which also was used to browse the World Wide Web. And therefore, our little AI worm finds some information which shouldn't be there. And guess what? That information is a press release by United Nations, which says United Nations is getting ready to vote on banning and destroying artificial intelligence in military capabilities. Now, what our little AI worm will do, having had this information, it does know it is an AI system in a military capabilities. Therefore, my question is, will this little worm do what it was planned to do, destroy the system, or take an aim at UN global headquarters? When I started telling this story, most people would have considered technology part of this as a fantasy. Nowadays, most people think that it is a fantasy, that UN can ever come to a global conclusion to ban AI from military systems. This is what we have seen just in 10 years' time. And of course, I mean, trying to contain these kind of risks, we need to think about singularity, because if we think about singularity and take into account that our tech cycle is so much quicker than our legal cycle, which deals with our international law space, only then can we protect us from the current level of risk where we have predictive AI only, 5G, 6G, space technologies. But you asked about costs. Estonian National Cybersecurity Authority budget in last 5 years has risen 5 times. I'm really worried.
You know, you raise a fantastic point, because in this week we saw President Biden sign an AI executive order. When he came into office, 4 months into office, he signed an executive order for cybersecurity. But Shyam, I'd love to get your thoughts as a former foreign secretary and ambassador. And Madam President talked about it. There's 21 international laws that touch upon cybersecurity, but it's not a holistic legislative bandwork. And at the same time, countries want to maintain their sovereignty, right? So this is the challenge. So how do we advance this idea to protect sovereignty, but also protect our society today in the cyberspace? It's not an easy balance, and you can use the Indian example as president of the G20 this year.
Thank you very much, John, and it's a pleasure to be back here. Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. You mentioned the Indian experience and, of course, the chairmanship of the G20. Our effort was to try and see that in an international landscape, which is today extremely polarized, very fragmented, how do we also at the same time try to keep alive a sense of international solidarity, a sense of collaboration in dealing with issues which are really cross-national in character. They are cross-cutting in character. Cybersecurity or climate change, if you take some of the examples, These are challenges which no country, no matter how powerful it is, can hope to resolve by itself. You need collaboration. And I think what we are unable to find is that, our whole negotiating frameworks are very competitive frameworks. If I go as a diplomat to a negotiating forum, what is my brief? My brief is give as little as you can, extract as much as you can, right? That is what we operate on. If you operate on that basis, should it come as a surprise to you that we always end up with a least common denominator result? When actually what you are looking for are maximal results, not minimal results. That is what cybersecurity is, because it is advancing so quickly that you are out of date before you even start trying to tackle it. So how do we ensure that for issues of this kind, we have a global collaborative mechanism in order to deal with this challenge? But today we are finding that the whole landscape, as I said, is very fragmented. You mentioned the global financial and economic crisis. Since then, we have not had any kind of crisis where the world has actually come together to try and really address the issue. So going forward, how do we bring this about? And I think in that context, fora like this and what our hosts have been able to organize still provides a forum where people from across the divide can still come together to try and see how we can deal with these problems. So going forward, I would say lot of opportunities, because we have seen in India itself that the digital space has actually allowed a degree of inclusion which we have not had before. So it is a very powerful tool. But we have also seen that there has been a tremendous amount of assault on the cyberspace from inimical forces. And how to keep that balance is what is going to occupy us going forward.
Okay, if I can ask a question here on the comparisons of what we've seen, and I'd love to get both of our other panelists involved in this. You sit on the board of Gavi, which is in charge of global vaccines, right? Mm-hmm. We had the Rio Agreement in 1992 to the foreign minister's interjection here, and very little action for the first 25 years, and we still struggle to have cohesiveness when it comes to climate action. Can we use those two examples and say, how do we not make the same mistakes as we develop policy for cybersecurity? How do we accelerate? Because AI is moving so quickly, and it could be an opportunity, but it could also be a great disruptor. Kirsty, do you want to start? And we'll come to President Barroso.
Yeah. Frankly speaking, our academia has been telling for a long time that the only way of dealing with it is to agree that all our analog legal space applies in a cyberspace. Exactly the same things which you cannot do in analog space, you cannot do in cyberspace. And we should simply decide that this is how it is. Also, the UN working groups regularly come to the same conclusion. So what you cannot do in the real world, the same things you cannot do in the digital sphere. But as we, follow the practices nowadays, for example, the physical situation doesn't seem so bad. Estonia last year had about 2,500 serious cyber attacks which we detected. Only one went through to the extent that real people couldn't buy some train tickets for a while. But all the rest was captured. So it can be done, but as I demonstrated, at the spiraling cost. So if we want to really spend on healthcare, education, what makes our world generally better, there is nothing else which takes us forward, than to decide if this is not to be done in analog, this cannot be done in cyberspace. In practice, we have already diverged nowadays because we do not have anywhere to go and complain about these attacks. Attribution is worthless because you don't have a Security Council where you can then go and complain. We should actually make our analog system, of course, work better, but then we should simply apply it also to our cyber systems.
Good. President Barroso, were you a bit frustrated sitting at Gavi and seeing that the global south was not getting the vaccines fast enough? And can you apply that to the lessons here as we develop the institute further, as Saudi Arabia convenes people to take action? What would be the advice, if you will, from your personal experience? And you lived through the financial crisis as well as a leader.
Exactly. So first of all, The results of the pandemic in terms of international cooperation were, let's say, mixed. We created COVAX, and COVAX was in some sense very successful because we were able to distribute more than 2 billion vaccines in the world, in 146 countries. But it is true that there was a difference between the more developed world and the developing, the poorest countries in the world. So, why? Because while, in theory, everybody recognizes that global public health is a global public good, because there should be no borders when it comes to fight against the virus, because the virus does not know borders, so we should have a common action. The reality is, and I'm very sincere, the advantage of being, I've left politics some time ago, so my level of sincerity is increasing day by day. So I'm telling you very frankly what I think. The reality is that we saw vaccine nationalism. We saw some countries accumulating many more vaccines than they needed. We saw disparities. At the same time, to be fair, we saw also great generosity. So some of the biggest donors increasing their donations, including in financial terms. So it's a mixed action. But one thing I believe it's important as a lesson for the future is to have a multi-stakeholder approach. I think it is a case, by the way, Gavi, that I have the honor to chair of the board, is based on that concept. So we have the governments of the richer countries, but on developing countries, but we also have the pharmaceutical companies, we have the private sector, we have research institutes, we have civic society organizations. I think this is very important. Because on the issue of cybersecurity, I think it's going to be even more difficult. Why? Because cybersecurity, let's be frank, is also linked to defense matters or war. And so some of the global powers will never share all the expertise they have in cybersecurity. They may share some, but not everything. For instance, against cybercrime in business, that's possible. According to the best statistics, it means $8 trillion per year, the cost of cybercrime, expected to go to 10.5 in 2 years' time. I think that's an area where different geopolitical interests and ideology, they can cooperate against this kind of cybercrime. But let's be realistic. There are areas where the countries will cooperate, others will not. And we need to bring also the know-how of the more prepared corporations in the world. We need also to apply here a concept of public-private partnership. That will be my advice.
Good. I want to get a quick follow-up from you, if I may, in my opening remarks. I'll be brief. I was talking about Saudi Arabia serving as a convener. It could lead from behind, but I think geographically and strategically, with the transformation that's taking place, and to put this into an institute and policy, can it be a bridge between China and the US, where, as you know, in technology, it's very fierce competition? And Madam President, if you can follow up as well. Please, President Barroso.
I think so. I think for instance, Saudi Arabia, during their presidency of G20 was doing a very important job. Now, Saudi Arabia is a member of G20. At the same time, it's a country of this BRICS Plus. It has good connections with both sides of the global argument. So I think it's a great place to have a global conversation. That's why we are here, by the way. Right. And at the same time, Saudi Arabia has also be developing real capabilities in this field, and other countries in the region as well. So yes, I believe we need places like that can offer a platform for cooperation, and I hope that that can be developed so that this global conversation, and not only conversation, hopefully some action can take place. But I'm realistic about what we can achieve, as you understood. And you mentioned it yourself, John. In the United Nations now, there is a stalemate on this. Let's be frank. There is a stalemate. Let's say, conventional wisdom is that we have to follow the principles of international law on cybersecurity, okay. But when it comes to an idea of having some supranational regulation, enforced binding agreement, then people some countries do not agree. So what we can do is, in what I call variable geometry, some, let's say, like-minded countries can go forward and hopefully extend as much as possible the areas of consensus to have, a possibility of reinforcing our cybersecurity.
Good. Madam President, you wanted to provide some follow-up as well. Go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm quite sure that countries like Saudi Arabia can catalyze positive developments. Like, for example, my own country certainly has catalyzed digital development in European Union, cross-border, because we have digital identities, Stone Age, if we talk nowadays technologies. European Union has decided that all EU countries have to offer all their citizens digital identities, and in addition, they have to interoperate. So, absolutely, this country can be a catalyst of the positive things. What needs to be catalyzed right now most is that we have to understand that if we compare 20th century to 21st century, in 20th century, most technological development always happened under control of the government. Internet happened under control of government, nuclear weapons similarly. Nowadays, far more of this development, which affects our cybersecurity, is company-led, happens in the private sector, in the industry. And here I see the great role for countries like Saudi Arabia to cooperate and call also for industry to apply the set of standards, to define the set of standards together with governments. And the first ones who are able to define these standards will normally prevail for the global standard-setting body. And by the way, these standards could give industry quite a lot of leeway in developing, which they're anyway doing. They have more resources than governments nowadays. But it also should invite them to voluntarily share with government what needs to be onboarded all the time into the regulation, because governments cannot regulate if they do not know what is cooking in the industry. And also, I think, thinking also of some incidents from the last year, if there is one company which is capable to play the government's game, affect geopolitical decisions by withholding their service from one party and not from the other party, there should be a mechanism which will make sure that the share price of that company tomorrow is very low. Because otherwise we cannot keep the sovereign's task only to the sovereigns. I'm sure Saudi Arabia understands these problems very well and can catalyze the positive process.
Good. We have the benefit of having His Excellency Amin Nasser from Aramco as one of the 4 partners that Ryan mentioned here. So they have the corporate sector very involved in cybersecurity, which I think is quite crucial at the front end of this process. Minister Saran, I'd love to get your thoughts on the ability to leapfrog through digital technologies. We saw the Indian example today, called it the belle of the ball at the Future Investment Initiative, because there's so much attention, so much growth. But how do we prevent the fact that if we don't get the cyberspace correctly, it erodes all that growth we saw in India? Or you take a case like Nigeria, leapfrogging away from the hard line into mobile. What's your view of the Global South and why it is so important to make sure we get this right on the collaboration our 2 other speakers have been highlighting so acutely?
So just to give you an example, that while the G20 summit was taking place in New Delhi, there were probably several thousand cyber attacks on the various sites which were associated with the G20 summit. And it was a huge challenge trying to protect our systems from such attacks. Now, it has just been mentioned that today, if you look at the UN system, where actually you should have a kind of collaborative responses to these kind of threats, you have actually the entire trend is going backwards, because we started with a document which was about 40 pages, and now it is more than 70 pages. Many of the issues which had been resolved have come back again, and some new ones have been added. So we are in a situation where it doesn't seem as if we can, for example, as India, can really depend upon the international system in order to provide us with the kind of capabilities that we need in order to deal with this situation. So this is where, at least over the next several years, our effort is really to try and see whether we can collaborate wherever it is possible, and we are doing that with many of our partners. Also, I think the importance of the forum of this kind is that, how do you regulate if you don't understand what the problem is? And I think today the gap between policymakers, decision makers, and the technology, the fact that, as it was mentioned, that it is, the private sector which actually is leading the advancement in this technology, unless you are able to get that information, get that knowledge across to decision makers, across to policy makers, there is not very little hope of regulation. So you mentioned the fact that a start had been made by President Biden's announcement. European Union has also, in fact, made some advance. We are trying to do that in India as well. But it is fora like this where that knowledge which is required by policymakers, that knowledge which is required by governments, perhaps this is a kind of forum where that kind of sensitization, that kind of awareness at least can be advanced. And that would be a very, very crucial component.
Yeah, what an excellent panel we have here, because you're going deep into the key topics that are faced with today. I'd love to tap, President Barroso, your experience as the European Commission President and the general data protection regulations, the GDPR, if I remember correctly. We've assumed that as the norm, which is very interesting, right? Because if you open a website today, it says, do you want to accept cookies or not? And people were pushing against that GDPR, but it did take public-private partnerships to kind of determine the roadmap, if you will. So it can be done, can it not in cyber?
Yes, it can, but it's difficult. In Europe, and now I'm with the experience of the European Union, I think the first proposal we've made, it was my first commission, 2006, 2007, but it was not entering into force before 2016, because we had to put together all the governments of the European Union. At that time, we were 28 before Brexit. And the reality is that in Europe, there is always this trade-off between scale and speed.
Yes.
The best thing is that we have scale, and that's a great example for globalization, because you have to put together 27 different countries. And among them, there are cultural differences as well, economic difference and interest. But at the end of the day, usually in Europe, we come to a compromise. So we have the scale of 27 countries. But of course, it's different to have 27 countries agreeing or 190 in the United Nations. In Europe, it takes time to come to a consensus of these 27 countries, but it's better than to do it only alone, each country on its own. As we have very often say in Europe, at least I've been saying, in Europe, all countries are small. The problem is that some have not noticed it yet. Because we need that scale. In Europe, we want to be on the same level as the United States and China, or India in terms of population. We need that scale that the cooperation gives. So I think from the point of view, it's a very good example of trying, through negotiation, to overcome differences. But to be honest, it also takes time. It's slower than if each country takes its own decisions. But at the end of the day, it's better. And now, when GDPR was launched, General Data Protection Regulation, in terms of data privacy, it was very much criticized. People said, oh, once again, the European Commission comes with all that bureaucracy. But now, all business in Europe agree that was an improvement. Can you imagine in business in Europe if each country in Europe, from France to Germany, from Italy to Sweden, from Netherlands to Spain, if each country had its own regulation, of course it will be a problem. And that's why, as you said, John, now it has, for instance, California, they followed very closely our GDPR. So in a way, it was setting a standard. So I think it makes sense with some, let's say, common sense. It makes sense and wisdom if we try to, in some areas, to have global standards, and the European Union can be a contributor for that.
Good. Madam President, you had your eyes looking at me. You're ready to jump in. Go ahead.
Yes, just a little advertisement. The European Union is now cooking AI Act, of course, and indeed GDPR became a de facto standard globally, but I'm sure that we need AI Act to become a de facto standard globally quicker even, so I would invite all like-minded countries who want to be part of it to kind of support similar standards and adhere our practices to this act when it comes out. I'm sure this is extremely important. On the other hand, it is also important that we have this regulation for the industry, for the surety of the investment. Because if you are investing into the Wild West where you don't know, you end up in explaining in some countries' parliament, we've seen it, I mean, in the first phases of tech development, why did you do this, why did you do that? Because you didn't tell us what is the regulation. And that is why I believe it is also very important in this region, which is also quite rich and important market, to come out with a certain set of standards to guarantee the security of the investment. This is extremely important, and this is what this country can do, and others close here. I would also like to say that in my understanding, all we have to do is to go back to our very basic principles and values and apply them for every generation of technology. Not now we have this one, we regulate this, and so on. And these are human rights, the rights of nation states to organize their life as they please, that we do not force each other's borders, all these basic principles, and simply to agree that never mind technology, this kind of decency, which we collectively have known for thousands of years, since Peloponnesus Wars, basically, that this decency, which applied then, applies now and will apply at every new technological level.
Interesting. Before I could bring in the former Foreign Minister of India, I'd love to, if I can, Madam President, this is a key issue, and it's one of those pillars that we talked about at the opening of the GCF in 2023. I say this kind of a jest. I have two daughters, and they always say, that woman is impressive. She's a girl boss. You know, she knows how to lead. I mean, you are the ultimate girl boss, president of Estonia, and it was a leader when it comes to technology. But why is it important, in your view, to get women more involved in cyber? And how do you match the curriculums of today? Because I always find, and now that I'm a practicing professor, I find that it's the business sector that goes to universities and says, we need this out of the pipeline. We need this sort of skills, and we need women engaged in this. And what's the relationship between government and universities and the private sector? Do you want to tackle that for us? And Shyam, I'd love to have you jump in as well, please.
Well, I am an honest believer into market forces, and if Estonian technology sector, and we, by the way, have 10 unicorns per 1.3 million people, this is double the density of United States. If this sector comes together and establishes Unicorn Squad, which is the tech training only for girls, then there must be something in it. And you know, I think what there is what has nothing to do with cyber or digital technologies. It so happens that half of the populations are women. Yes. Therefore, half of the good ideas come into the heads of women. And if you do not tap into that reserve and these resources, then you are losing 50% of your capability. And this is a too big chance to lose for the markets. That is why Estonian tech sector has come together and done this work for the government.
Good, but the universities, and I'd like to have Shyam do that as well. Yeah, it's worth noting in the last 6 years, we've gone from almost zero female participation in the workforce to 37% and rising. It's changing very quickly here, right? But Shyam, do you want to cover this role of the universities to keep pace with the change in technology at the same time?
You know, the big challenge really that I'm talking about the Indian experience.
Sure.
You know, at the end of the day, what are you trying to do? You are trying to wrap your analog mind over a digital space. And that's very challenging. How do you do that? And in that respect, you know, the participation of society in this whole endeavor, not something which is top down, but something which we see happening in India. It's a very traditional society. And yet you see that because of these advancements in the digital space, there are good things happening, but there are also bad things happening, including as far as women's rights are concerned. So this is something which really sort of makes you very much focused on how do you prevent those kind of negative things from happening. And participation of women in a very active way in this space is one of the ways that you can actually address those negative trends. I am very impressed by the fact that in our host country, as a result of recent reforms, you have a very educated, women constituency, 50%, whose brain power has suddenly been added to this economy. And that's a huge, huge resource which has been brought into play. And I think in terms of cyberspace itself, if I'm not mistaken, women in Saudi Arabia are playing perhaps a very, very important and critical role. So this shows how, in this space, having women as equal participants really kind of changes the societal impact of what is this technology doing to us. We have not really focused attention on the societal impact. There are, impacts on the human psyche. There are impacts as far as society is concerned. And while we are very much focused on technology, perhaps we sometimes, are guilty of forgetting about those kind of impacts because we are so much dazzled by the technology that we don't really look at the human aspect. That's why I said, with analog minds, trying to manage cyberspace is not very easy.
Okay. I'm going to circle back afterwards, Madam President, on your foundation before we finish the session, because you're starting to study the impact on society of technology, which I think should be a very important component. Oftentimes we look at, the cyberspace and AI and speed and access to information, but should be a calculation of the societal change. But I wanted to get the panel's view. We did a podcast for the GCF, which is a phenomenal series, but we looked at through the media, obviously, because of my experience, and I was suggesting cybersecurity should be a top 5 issue of society today. And then we had a debate within the GCF Institute saying, well, maybe over time, in a very near period of time, it should be a top 3 issue, because it touches everyone. Do you want to share where you think? Because it doesn't seem to be on the top radar. If you poll people, they say inflation, worried about climate change, cost of living, right? Security, conflict. Where does cyber fit into that, President Barroso?
I agree with your concern because cybersecurity is more specific. It's related to other issues that are very important top concerns, namely security. It's the word security. And now in the world, people, besides, of course, the economic situation that is affecting so many people, they are worried with security in general, and cybersecurity is part of that. But I believe it's going to gain preeminence. It's true also that in spite of the very important costs, namely for business, that are paying a big cost because of all the disruption, intrusion, all the problems that we are seeing in the business sector, the reality is that until now, knock on wood, there has not been a major, let's say, catastrophic event globally of cybersecurity. Until now. For 2 reasons. Those who have the power to create it are not willing to create it. I mean, the governments that have the power to create a major disruption until now have avoided it. And also those who could create it, that have not the capacity. I mean, non-state actors. Because if you think about terrorist organizations, or even, let's say, criminal networks, that could be extremely disruptive, until now, apparently, they have not yet the skills, the technical capability to create that major event. But what we have to think in terms of risk management is, what happens if one of the biggest global players, state player, decides to create a real disruptive attack globally? Or if one terrorist organization or one criminal network is able to acquire that technology. And we are not yet there. I hope we will not be. So, but in terms of prudent management and risk management, in terms of wisdom, if I may use the word, what we have to do is to prepare for that situation. That's why, in linking to the last question we have put, I think it's so important that the governments of the world, responsible governments of the world, they match the technological developments with the investment, public investment, including in skills. For instance, in Europe, the European Agency for Cybersecurity estimates that we need 200,000 cyber experts. We are lacking. Men and women, of course, men and women. But we are lacking that. So we need more investment to manage the risk that can come from cybersecurity threats.
Okay. I'm going to wrap it up. We had a longer time here, so I'm going to just ask for 2 final thoughts and we'll conclude. Madam President, and then Cheyenne, please, very quickly.
You mentioned my foundation. President Kaljulaid Foundation was set up to understand how Estonian society, which for 20 years and slightly more is now receiving all public service online, how this has changed our society. And guess what? This year we understood we have to establish Academy of Democracy for our youth. You know why? Because we came to understanding that when we went to school, you and I, then we learned our emotional intelligence from interacting with each other. And we, for 10 years, thought that we need to prepare our children for life in tech, surrounded by tech, in teaching them tech. But it's actually counterintuitively that we have to teach them how to remain compassionate human beings.
Yeah,
and this is the most valuable conclusion. Technology is not going to make us safe and secure. Being compassionate human beings, knowing how to remain a society through all the challenges, this is which finally defines the future of humankind. Maybe somebody's disappointed. It's not technology, it's still us. Thank you.
Yeah, trying to find that balance is important. Yeah, I completely agree. And I'm sorry to rush us, but Chaim, your final thoughts, and then we'll say our thanks to you.
Well, I would only say that, at the end of the day, we are still, physical beings, flesh and blood. And I think while we take the digital space as an instrument, it should not overwhelm us. I think that's very, very important. Thank you.
Good. What a fantastic session. I really appreciate the depth in which you gave the thoughts of all the major topics that we're going to have over the next 2 days. President Barroso, thanks for the time yesterday, because we had a deep discussion of where we're going with cyber. So President Barroso, President Kujat, it's nice to see you. Thank you very much. I'll say Madam President. And Minister Sharan, great to see you again here at the GCF. Can we give him a nice round of applause for the participation?